Oh my God. I still can't believe this actually happened. I was just trying to check out a cabin, literally just look at it, and this lady comes storming out like I'd crashed a private country club. Starts interrogating me at the gate like I didn't belong there. And then, things got weird, fast. I'm Mason Hale, and what went down next? Man, it's one for the books. If you've been around QA stories before, you already know these HOA types never disappoint. But this one, she took it somewhere else entirely. Ever had someone go full power trip on you over nothing? I'd seriously love to hear about. Drop it in the comments. After decades of interrogating liars for a living, I could spot fake friendliness a mile away, even when it smiled behind a clipboard. So, here's how this whole mess started. I'm 40, 2 years old, recently retired from a pretty demanding career that I'll get into later, and I was looking for a short-term cabin rental at this upscale lakefront community called Pine Lake Estates. I wasn't looking to buy anything permanent, just wanted a quiet place to decompress for a few months while I figured out my next move. The property owner had posted this gorgeous lakefront cabin online, and after a few phone calls, we set up an appointment for me to come take a look. Seemed straightforward enough, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong with a simple cabin rental? Looking back, I should have known better. Nothing in my life has ever been that simple. I drove up to Pine Lake Estates on a beautiful Tuesday morning, and honestly, the place was stunning. Manicured lawns, pristine driveways, these massive lakefront properties with perfectly maintained docks stretching out into crystal, clear water. The kind of neighborhood where you'd expect to see kids riding bikes and families having barbecues on weekends. But as I pulled up to the community gate, something felt off. I can't explain it exactly, but after 22 years in law enforcement, you develop this instinct about places and people. The whole area felt too controlled, too sterile, like someone was watching everything way too closely. The security cameras weren't just pointing at the gate, they were angled toward specific properties, creating blind spots that seemed deliberately planned. That's when I met Susan Mercer for the first time. She literally appeared out of nowhere as I was trying to figure out the gate system marching toward my car, with this expression that screamed, "You don't belong here." She was probably in her mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing what looked like expensive workout clothes, the kind of person who carried herself like she owned the place and everyone in it. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" she demanded before I'd even rolled my window all the way down. Not hello or can I help you, just straight to the interrogation. I tried to stay polite because honestly, maybe she was just being cautious about strangers. "I'm here to see the lakefront cabin rental," I told her. "I have an appointment with the owner." The words came out measured and professional, a habit from years of escalating tense situations. But instead of relaxing, her expression got even more hostile. "Oh, that property," she said like the words tasted bad in her mouth. "I'm afraid it's not really suitable for someone like you." Someone like me, I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but that phrase sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Someone like me?" I asked, genuinely confused. I mean, I was dressed nicely, driving a clean car, being completely respectful. What exactly was she seeing that made me unsuitable? "We have certain standards here at Pine Lake Estates," she continued, and I swear she looked at me up and down like she was evaluating livestock. "We prefer established families with proper backgrounds." Proper backgrounds. There it was. I'd heard that exact phrase countless times in my previous career, and it never meant anything good. The coding was so obvious it might as well have been written in neon letters. Before I could even respond, she was calling over to someone. "John, please escort this gentleman out. People like him make our residents feel unsafe." People like him, not this specific person who's acting suspiciously, just people like him. I watched this security guard start walking over, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable, like he really didn't want to be part of whatever Susan was doing. That's when I started paying closer attention to everything around me. The way security cameras seemed pointed specifically at certain cabins. How for sale signs only appeared in front of properties that looked like they belonged to non-white families. The way Susan kept glancing around like she was performing for an audience of neighbors who might be watching. A woman across the street had stopped watering her garden and was openly staring at our exchange, her expression somewhere between concern and curiosity. I'd seen this exact pattern before in my law enforcement career. The coded language, the selective treatment, the way certain people got different rules than others. My old cop instincts kicked in automatically, and I started mentally cataloging everything I was witnessing. But I also realized I was standing at a crossroads here. I could just drive away, find another rental, and pretend this never happened. Or I could push back and see exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. "Are you familiar with fair housing laws, ma'am?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional. The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. Her confident superiority melted into something that looked like panic mixed with anger. "That's none of your business," she snapped, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was trying to figure out if I was just some random guy throwing around legal terms, or if I actually knew what I was talking about. The woman across the street had dropped her hose completely now, water pooling around her feet as she listened. "I used to work in law enforcement," I said, carefully watching her reaction. "This situation feels very familiar to me." She flinched just barely, enough for a trained observer to notice, but maybe not enough for her to admit it. I could literally see her mind racing, probably wondering if she'd just stepped into some kind of trap. Had she been discriminating against an undercover cop? Was I recording this conversation? Was she about to get arrested right there in front of her precious community? I wasn't sure if I should feel satisfied or concerned about how terrified she suddenly looked. Part of me wanted to end her misery right then and explain exactly who I was, but honestly I was curious to see how far she'd take this. Would she back down and apologize, or would she double down and make things even worse for herself? Looking back, I probably should have just shown my credentials right then and saved us both a lot of trouble. But something about her attitude made me want to see what she'd do next. The security guard had stopped walking halfway to my car, clearly sensing the shift in tension. The neighbor across the street was now joined by another woman, both of them watching our exchange with obvious interest. Susan's hands were actually shaking slightly as she gripped her clipboard, and I could see beads of sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool morning air. "Mr. What did you say your name was?" she asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Hale," I replied simply. "Mason Hale." She repeated my name under her breath like she was memorizing it for some future purpose, and I realized this woman was already planning her next move. Whatever it was going to be, I had a feeling it wasn't going to be an apology, and that I thought should have been the end of it. But something about the way she stared at my license plate told me this wasn't over, not even close. Her expression had calcified like she'd just swallowed a mouthful of sand, and there was a calculating look in her eyes that reminded me of every criminal I'd ever interviewed who thought they were smarter than the system. As I drove away from that gate, I caught her in my rearview mirror, already pulling out her phone and dialing with the frantic energy of someone who just declared war. I had no idea at the time that she was about to turn what should have been a simple rental inquiry into a federal civil rights case. But then again, some people just can't help themselves when it comes to digging their own graves. Her expression calcified when she heard law enforcement, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. But instead of backing down like a reasonable person, would Susan Mercer decided to dig herself deeper into whatever hole she was creating. Maybe I should have just walked away at that point. I don't know. But something about her entire attitude made me want to test exactly how far this discrimination went. So I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. I decided to test the system by officially applying for that lakefront cabin rental. The next morning, I called Susan directly and told her I wanted to move forward with the rental application process. There was this long pause on the phone, like she was trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. "Mr. Hale," she finally said, and I could hear the fake sweetness in her voice. "I want to make sure you understand that our application process is quite thorough. We take community safety and compatibility very seriously here at Pine Lake Estates." Community safety, compatibility, more code words that made my skin crawl. "I appreciate thoroughness," I told her. "I'm sure you follow all the proper legal procedures." Another pause. "Of course we do. Everything we do is completely legal and above board." The way she emphasized legal told me she'd already been on the phone with someone, probably a lawyer, trying to figure out how much trouble she might be in. 3 days later, I received what had to be the most ridiculous rental application I'd ever seen in my life. The paperwork looked more like a federal clearance packet than a rental form, pages of background checks, lifestyle assessments, even questions about political views veiled in legalese. Most rental applications are 2, maybe 3 pages max. This thing was 15 pages of pure bureaucratic harassment. 10. Year employment history with contact information for every single job. 4 personal references who had known me for at least 5 years. Credit check, background check, and something called a community compatibility assessment that wasn't explained anywhere in the paperwork. When I called to ask about that last one, Susan's assistant, who sounded absolutely miserable by the way, told me it was a standard evaluation to ensure new residents would be a good fit for our community values. But here's the part that really got me. You could close on a house, get married, and grow tomatoes in that time. Processing typically takes 4 to 6 weeks for thorough review of all documentation and reference checks. The cover letter explained. 4 to 6 weeks for a simple cabin rental. I've seen people buy houses faster than that. So, naturally, I started doing a little investigating of my own. I'm not even sure why I thought it was a good idea to dig deeper, but once you've been in law enforcement for over 2 decades, it's hard to just ignore obvious patterns of suspicious behavior. I started making some phone calls, asking around about other people who'd tried to rent in Pine Lake Estates recently. What I found wasn't exactly shocking, but it was definitely disgusting. 3 families had withdrawn their applications the previous year after months of runaround. All 3 were minorities. One was a young black couple with twin toddlers, another was a Hispanic family where the husband was a doctor, and the third was an Asian family who owned their own business. Meanwhile, I found out that white applicants typically got approved within 1 week, sometimes faster. I managed to track down one of the families who had given up on their application, and the conversation was eye-opening. "Don't waste your time, man," the guy told me over the phone. He didn't want to give me his name, which I totally understood. They have a whole system designed to keep certain people out. I tried for 3 months. They kept asking for more documentation, more references, more background checks. That's when the emails started getting really interesting. Susan sent me additional requirements almost daily. Further documentation needed for community safety assessment and neighborhood compatibility review. Additional references required to verify character and lifestyle compatibility. Extended background check necessary due to your previous employment in law enforcement. That last one was particularly fascinating. Apparently being a cop was somehow a red flag for their community safety assessment. I had to read that email 3 times before I could believe someone had actually written it. Seriously, did she really think that made sense? A law enforcement officer being considered a safety risk to a gated community. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I decided to push back just to see what would happen. I sent her a very polite, very professional email, asking if these were standard procedures for all applicants and whether she could provide me with the specific legal authority for some of these unusual requirements. Just for the record, I wrote back, "Federal housing guidelines don't include neighborhood personality tests, yet." The response came back within 2 hours, which was suspicious since everything else had taken days. "Mr. Hale, our application process has been carefully developed by our legal team to ensure full compliance with all applicable laws. If you're uncomfortable with our thorough vetting procedures, perhaps Pine Lake Estates isn't the right community for you." The subtext was clear: take the hint and go away. That's when Susan made the mistake of calling me directly. I could hear the tension in her voice before she even started talking. "What exactly do you do for work, Mr. Hale?" she asked, like she was conducting some kind of interrogation. Looking back, I should have just told her the truth right then. It would have saved both of us a lot of trouble, but something about her tone made me want to keep playing this game a little longer. "I'm a consultant," I told her, which was technically true. "I help organizations stay compliant with federal regulations." There was a long pause. I could almost hear her Googling me in her head. "What kind of compliance?" she finally asked, and I could hear the panic starting to creep into her voice through the phone. "Civil rights compliance mostly, fair housing, equal treatment, that sort of thing." I wasn't lying. That's exactly what I'd been doing in my consulting work since retirement, but I also wasn't telling her the whole truth about my background, yet. I've worked with a lot of communities that had issues with discriminatory practices. Another long pause. "Mr. Hale, I hope you're not implying that Pine Lake Estates engages in any kind of discrimination." "I'm not implying anything, Ms. Mercer. I'm just documenting what I observe." And that was the truth. I'd been keeping detailed records of every interaction, every email, every ridiculous requirement they'd thrown at me. Part of me wanted to tell her everything right then, and save us both a lot of trouble, but honestly, I was too curious about how far she'd take this charade. The phone conversation with Susan had left me with a pretty clear picture of what I was dealing with, and honestly, part of me felt a little bad about the whole situation. But then I remembered that young family with twin toddlers who had been jerked around for months, and my sympathy pretty much evaporated. I decided it was time to request a face-to-face meeting at the HOA office. When I suggested it, there was another one of those long pauses that were becoming Susan's signature move. "I suppose we could meet," she finally said, probably thinking she could intimidate me better in person on her home turf. "Thursday at 2 o'clock, my office at the community center." The way she said "my office" made it clear she thought having me on her territory would give her some kind of psychological advantage. The Pine Lake Estates Community Center was exactly what you'd expect. All glass and stone and expensive landscaping, the kind of place designed to make visitors feel either impressed or intimidated, depending on who they were. I showed up right on time, and Susan was waiting for me in her office, sitting behind this massive mahogany desk, like she was conducting a board meeting. She'd clearly prepared for this conversation with a stack of papers in front of her and that fake professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. A security camera in the corner of the room blinked red. I made sure it caught every word. "Mr. Hale," she said as I sat down, "I don't appreciate you questioning our established procedures." Her assistant, a nervous-looking woman in her 30s, kept avoiding eye contact and shuffling papers at a desk near the door. "I'm not questioning them, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice calm and level. "I'm documenting them." The smile disappeared completely. Documenting them. For what purpose? Now, this was interesting. She was trying to sound authoritative, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath. "Pattern analysis," I told her. "I've encountered this exact scenario before in other communities." That wasn't entirely true. I'd mostly dealt with employment discrimination cases, not housing. But the principles were identical, and she didn't need to know the specifics of my background yet. I started pointing out the obvious inconsistencies in their application process, using language that was straightforward enough for anyone to understand. Selective enforcement, when some applicants got fast, tracked while others faced endless delays. Different standards for different people, when the documentation requirements seemed to change based on who was applying. Unusual procedures that had no clear legal justification. I watched Susan's face get more and more flushed as I calmly listed each problem with their system. She kept trying to interrupt with explanations that made no sense, but I just kept talking in that steady professional tone that I'd perfected over 2 decades of dealing with people who thought they were smarter than the law. Her assistant was practically shrinking into her chair at this point, clearly recognizing that her boss was in way over her head. "Are you some kind of lawyer trying to build a case?" Susan finally blurted out when I paused to take a breath. I had to stop and stare at her after that one. Did she really think lawyers were the only people who understood basic civil rights law? "Not a lawyer," I said, "but I do know housing law quite well, and I definitely know discrimination when I see it." The color drained right out of her face. "Mr. Hale, that's a very serious accusation." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "That's why I don't make it lightly." That's when Susan shifted into full damage control mode. She started threatening to call the police for harassment and intimidation. She claimed I was disturbing the peace of our community just by asking questions about their application process. She even pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of me, saying she was documenting everything for a potential lawsuit. I actually had to laugh at that one. "Ms. Mercer, you're photographing me sitting calmly in a chair during a meeting you agreed to have. What exactly are you planning to tell your lawyer about this evidence?" Her assistant looked like she wanted to crawl under her desk and disappear forever. But then I decided to drop the bomb that had been building up through this entire ridiculous conversation. "Before you make this situation worse, Ms. Mercer, you should know, I've already filed an official complaint." Her phone literally slipped out of her hand and clattered onto the desk. "A complaint with who, exactly?" "With the people whose job it is to handle housing discrimination cases." I didn't specify whether I meant the local Fair Housing Authority, the State Civil Rights Commission, or the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. Let her imagination fill in the blanks. The blood literally drained from her face when I said discrimination cases. I realized I was standing at a major crossroads here. I could reveal exactly who I was right now and end this quickly, or I could let her dig herself even deeper into a hole she might never be able to climb out of. Looking back, I'm still not sure which choice would have been the right one. Part of me wanted to end her misery and just show my credentials, but another part of me, the part that had spent years investigating people who abused their authority, wanted to see exactly how far she'd go to cover up what she'd been doing. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice was shaking now. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Pine Lake Estates follows all applicable laws. We've never discriminated against anyone." "Then you should have no problem with an official investigation," I replied. "People who aren't doing anything wrong usually welcome the opportunity to clear their names." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see her brain working overtime, trying to figure out if I was bluffing or if she was about to face the kind of legal nightmare that could destroy everything she'd built. "What do you want?" she finally asked, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. That question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting to the whole situation, but it sounded like she was trying to negotiate some kind of deal. "I want your community to follow the law," I told her. "I want all applicants to be treated fairly, regardless of their race or background. And I want the families who were driven away by your discriminatory practices to get the apology they deserve." She was quiet for a long time after that, staring down at her hands. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed completely. Instead of the arrogant, controlling woman I'd been dealing with, she looked genuinely afraid. Her assistant had stopped even pretending to work and was openly staring at both of us, probably wondering if she should update her resume. "How do I know you won't just destroy us anyway?" she asked, and honestly I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. But then I remembered all those families who'd been treated like garbage and the feeling passed. "Ms. Mercer, I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm trying to fix a broken system. There's a difference." I wasn't sure if she believed me, but at that point I wasn't sure it mattered. She'd already made her choices, and those choices were about to have consequences whether she understood it or not. The funny thing is, she thought she was still winning. She didn't realize she'd just handed me a loaded legal grenade, with her name etched on the side. As I walked out of that office, I could hear her frantically dialing her phone, probably calling every lawyer she knew. Susan stared at me for what felt like forever after I mentioned the official complaint, and I could practically see her brain short, circuiting as she tried to figure out her next move. I wish I could tell you I kept my cool during the awkward silence, but honestly, I was starting to guess myself. I wasn't sure if I was holding her accountable or playing God in a HOA courtroom she built. Was I taking this too far? Maybe I should have just walked away and found another rental somewhere else. But then I thought about that family with the twin toddlers again, and I knew I couldn't just let this slide. What happened next was something I definitely didn't see coming. Instead of trying to negotiate or apologize, Susan went into full panic mode. Within an hour of our meeting, she was on the phone with the HOA's lawyer, demanding an emergency consultation. I know this because one of the neighbors, a sweet elderly woman who'd been watching this whole drama unfold, called to warn me. She wasn't unraveling, she was calculating, sprinting through damage control, like a CEO mid-scandal. "That woman is absolutely losing her mind," she told me. "She's been making phone calls and sending emails all afternoon. She's demanding that you be permanently banned from the property and threatening to get a restraining order for stalking and harassment, for asking questions about a rental application." I actually had to laugh at that one. The community was starting to split into camps over the whole situation. Some residents were backing Susan completely. "He's just causing trouble for everyone," I heard one guy say. "We moved here for peace and quiet, not to deal with troublemakers stirring up legal problems." But others were whispering privately about how maybe someone had finally stood up to Susan's controlling behavior. Mrs. Delgado leaned in, whispered, "She's been calling black families visually disruptive for years. We all saw it. We just didn't say it." That conversation was enlightening, but also frustrating. If people knew what was happening, why hadn't anyone spoken up before? Instead of getting emotional or defensive, I decided to do what I'd been trained to do, document everything systematically. But this time felt different. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was building a case, and this time the walls were closing in on her. I started recording conversations with Susan's permission, photographing any discriminatory signage or policy documents I could find, and collecting written statements from residents who were willing to talk about their experiences. It was actually kind of therapeutic falling back into that methodical investigative process that had been such a big part of my career. But I also realized that my calm professional approach was probably making Susan even more paranoid. She couldn't figure out if I was just some random guy with too much time on his hands, or if I was something much more dangerous to her little kingdom. That's when Susan made the biggest mistake of this entire saga. She sent me an official letter on HOA letterhead that was so legally problematic I had to read it 3 times to believe someone had actually signed their name to it. "You are hereby banned from this community," the letter stated. "Any further contact with residents or HOA staff will be considered criminal harassment and reported to authorities. Your application for rental has been permanently denied due to your disruptive behavior and failure to meet community standards. Criminal harassment for asking questions about housing discrimination, community standards that were never clearly defined. I was holding evidence of retaliation, and she'd put it in writing with her official signature. I called her back immediately after reading that letter. "Ms. Mercer, that letter you just sent might actually constitute evidence of retaliation under federal law. You might want to run that by your lawyer before you send anything else." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "What do you mean retaliation?" she finally asked, and I could hear the fear creeping back into her voice. "It's illegal to punish someone for filing a discrimination complaint or asserting their civil rights. That letter you sent could be seen as exactly that kind of punishment." Another long pause. "I was just protecting our community. From what? From someone asking questions about your application process." When I walked past the clubhouse that evening, the string lights were dimmed, but I could see her silhouette pacing through the glass, on the phone, desperate. You know, I've shared stories like this before on storytelling platforms, but I never imagined I'd actually be living through one myself. Life has a weird sense of irony that way. Here I was supposedly enjoying a peaceful retirement, and I'd stumbled into exactly the kind of civil rights case that had defined my entire career. But this time, instead of investigating it from the outside, I was right in the middle of it as the target. It was surreal and infuriating, and oddly satisfying all at the same time. More neighbors started coming forward with their own stories about Susan's behavior. Mrs. Miller, an Asian woman whose family had been living in the community for 3 years, told me about the constant complaints Susan filed against them. Different rules, constant complaints about everything we do that other families do without any problems, she said, and the pain in her voice was obvious. Our children playing in the common areas, our guests parking in visitor spots, even the way we maintain our garden. She finds fault with everything, but only when it's our family. These weren't isolated incidents or personality conflicts. This was a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement that had been going on for years. But instead of backing down or trying to fix the problem, Susan decided to end this once and for all by escalating to the nuclear option. She called 911 with what I later learned were completely false accusations designed to get me arrested and removed from the situation permanently. I didn't know about the call when she made it, but I found out later exactly what she told the dispatcher. "I need police at Lakefront Estates immediately. There's a man who's been harassing our entire community for weeks. He claims to be some kind of government investigator, but I believe he's lying and potentially dangerous. He's been threatening residents. Government investigator, potentially dangerous, threatening residents." Every single word was either a complete lie or a deliberate distortion of what had actually happened. But Susan was so desperate at that point, I think she would have said anything to get law enforcement on her side and me out of her community. What would you do in my position? Stay calm or fight back? I mean, when someone calls the police and lies about you being dangerous, it's pretty much a natural reaction to want to defend yourself, right? But I knew from experience that the best thing to do when police arrive is to stay calm, cooperate completely, and let the facts speak for themselves. I heard those sirens getting closer and felt my chest tighten. She had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life, but she had no idea yet. Or maybe I was the one who had just made a terrible mistake by letting this situation go this far. I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that in a few minutes everything was about to change, and there was no going back from whatever happened next. I heard those sirens getting closer, and honestly my heart started racing. Not because I was afraid of the police. After 2 years in law enforcement, cops don't make me nervous. But because I knew that Susan had just crossed a line that was going to have serious consequences for her, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to be responsible for whatever happened next. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the community center and I watched as 2 officers got out. Officer Rodriguez looked like a veteran, probably in his 40s, calm and professional, the kind of cop who'd seen everything and didn't get rattled easily. Officer Kim was younger, maybe late 20s, still had that alert energy that comes with being relatively new to the job. Susan was literally running toward their cars before they'd even closed their doors. Talking so fast, I'm surprised they could understand her. Officers, thank God you're here. This man has been harassing our entire community for weeks. He claims to be some kind of federal investigator, but I'm absolutely certain he's lying. He's been making threats against residents and trying to intimidate our HOA board. Federal investigator. I actually had to admire her creativity. She'd managed to take the fact that I'd mentioned law enforcement experience and turn it into something that sounded much more dramatic and threatening. But watching her frantically gesturing and talking over herself, I realized she was way more panicked than I'd thought. She was beaming like she'd just written her own press release. Officers, I said as they approached, keeping my voice calm and level. I'm completely happy to cooperate with you. There seems to be a serious misunderstanding here. Officer Rodriguez nodded and looked at me with that neutral cop expression that doesn't give anything away. Sir, can you explain your side of what's been happening? I simply applied to rent a property in this community. When I was denied, I questioned whether the denial process was fair and legal. That's my right as an American citizen. Simple, factual, no drama. I'd learned a long time ago that when you're dealing with police, the best approach is always calm honesty. But Susan wasn't about to let me control the narrative. He's lying to you. He told me he works for the government. He said he's investigating us. He's been threatening legal action and trying to scare residents. I had to stop and stare at her after that outburst. The way she was describing our conversations, you'd think I'd been running around the neighborhood with a megaphone threatening to have everyone arrested. Ma'am, I said to her directly, I never claimed to work for the government. I told you I do consulting work related to compliance issues. When I encounter potential violations of federal law, I report them through proper official channels. That's what any responsible citizen should do. Officer Kim stepped forward with his notepad ready. Sir, we're going to need to see some identification to verify who you are. Absolutely, officers, I replied. I always cooperate fully with law enforcement. And that was the moment of truth. I could see Susan standing there with this victorious expression spreading across her face. She was absolutely certain she was about to expose me as some kind of fraud who'd been lying about my background and credentials. She probably thought the officers would find out I was just some random troublemaker with no actual authority or experience, and then they'd arrest me for filing false complaints or harassment or whatever charge she'd convinced herself applied to this situation. What kind of ID do you think I'm about to show them? I wanted to ask her, but I kept my mouth shut and just reached for my wallet. The leather felt familiar in my hands. I'd carried the same style of credential case for over 2 decades, and even though I was officially retired, I still had my consulting credentials that allowed me to work on civil rights cases. But more importantly, I still had the official identification that would explain exactly who Susan Mercer had been dealing with for the past 2 weeks. I slowly reached for my wallet while Susan watched with that triumphant smile spreading across her face. This was the moment of truth. Everything would be decided right here, right now. But as my fingers touched the leather credential case in my wallet, I couldn't help wondering, was I about to solve everything, or was I about to create a completely new set of problems I hadn't anticipated? Part of me was still second, guessing the whole situation. Had I been too aggressive? Should I have just walked away from the beginning and found a different rental? Was I about to humiliate someone who was just ignorant and hungry rather than actually malicious? But then I thought about Mrs. Miller and that young family with the twins and all the other people who had been treated like garbage by Susan's discriminatory system. They deserved better than to have their civil rights trampled by someone who thought her position as HOA president gave her the authority to decide which families belonged in her community. Officer Rodriguez was waiting patiently for my identification, and I could see Officer Kim positioning himself slightly to the side. Standard procedure when you don't know if a situation might escalate. Here we go, I said quietly, pulling out my credential case. I think this is going to clear up a lot of confusion. And honestly, that might have been the understatement of the year. I pulled out my wallet, but instead of reaching for a regular driver's license like Susan was probably expecting, I removed the official leather credential mount that I'd carried for over 2 decades. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Kim both recognized what it was immediately. You don't spend time in law enforcement without knowing what official credentials look like. Then she saw the badge, and the smile shattered. The moment I opened that credential case and handed it to Officer Rodriguez, everything changed. I pulled out my wallet, but instead of reaching for a regular driver's license like Susan was probably expecting, I removed the official leather credential case that I'd carried for over 2 decades. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Kim both recognized what it was immediately. You don't spend time in law enforcement without knowing what official credentials look like. But Susan was still standing there with that triumphant expression, probably thinking I was about to hand over some fake ID or expired security guard license that would prove everything she'd been saying about me. The moment I opened that credential case and handed it to Officer Rodriguez, everything changed. Official federal law enforcement credentials, retired chief of police, still active under civil rights consulting clearance. Officer Rodriguez looked at the credentials, then looked at me, then straightened up immediately. "Chief, sir, we had no idea." The word chief hung in the air like a bomb going off. I watched Susan's confident, triumphant expression freeze completely as she processed what she'd just heard. Her pupils contracted like the air had just thinned, like altitude sickness from power collapse. "Retired chief," I corrected, "but I still do consulting work on civil rights cases when discrimination patterns are identified." Susan tried to speak, but nothing came out except this weird squeaking sound. She just stared at the badge in Officer Rodriguez's hands, like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Police chief, this is real," she finally whispered. 22 years in law enforcement," I confirmed. "Retired chief of police. I specialize in investigating civil rights violations and discrimination cases in communities like this one." And that's when the full reality of her situation finally hit her. Every threatening email she'd sent, every discriminatory action she'd taken, every retaliatory threat she'd made, all of it had been documented by an actual federal investigator with the credentials and experience to make it stick. Her emails still warm in my inbox were now evidence, time-stamped, cross-referenced, ready to testify. Officer Kim looked between me and Susan with obvious confusion. "Chief, is there currently an active investigation of this community?" "There is now," I told him. "Ms. Mercer's community has demonstrated concerning patterns that definitely warrant law enforcement review and intervention." The commotion had drawn neighbors out of their houses, and word was spreading through the community like wildfire. "He's a real federal housing inspector," I heard someone say. "She called the cops on a police chief," someone else whispered. Within minutes, there were probably 15 or 20 residents standing around watching this whole scene unfold. And that's when Mrs. Miller stepped forward with the kind of courage that I'd been hoping to see from someone in this community. "Officers," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "this woman has been systematically discriminating against minority families in our lakefront community for years. She enforces completely different rules for different people based entirely on their race and ethnicity." Other neighbors started nodding and murmuring agreement. "She files complaints against our family for things that white families do without any problems," Mrs. Miller continued. "Our children playing in common areas, our guests parking in visitor spots, even the way we maintain our garden. But only when it's our family." Susan was locked in place as if her clipboard had turned into a courtroom exhibit. I could see the wheels turning in her head, probably realizing that not only had her plan completely backfired, but she'd actually made her legal situation about 10 times worse by lying to the police. From the back of the crowd, someone hissed, "She called the cops on internal affairs." Laughter rippled, uneasy but growing. The crowd of neighbors was getting bigger, and the mood was shifting dramatically. "She told us our barbecue smoke was bothering other residents, but the white family next door has barbecues every weekend," one man said. "She sent us a formal complaint about our children being too loud in the playground, but only after she found out we were Hispanic," another woman added. It was like a dam had burst, and years of suppressed frustration were pouring out all at once. Officer Rodriguez handed my credentials back to me with obvious respect. "Chief, what would you like us to do about the false report she filed?" "That's up to you, officers. But filing a false police report is a serious criminal charge, especially when it's done in retaliation for someone asserting their civil rights." He didn't need to say the word arrest, but it hung there heavy as the badge in his palm. Susan made this strangled sound like she was choking on her own words. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she'd treated every minority family who'd tried to join this community, and my sympathy evaporated pretty quickly. "Ms. Mercer," I said, and my voice was calm but firm. Every single email you sent me, every discriminatory action you've taken, every retaliatory threat you've made, all of it is now official evidence in a civil rights discrimination case. She tried to speak, but nothing came out except another one of those weird squeaking sounds. The police officers were professional and thorough, taking statements from multiple residents about the pattern of discriminatory behavior they'd witnessed. Susan just stood there like a statue while her entire community turned against her. The police officers, now fully understanding the real situation, turned their attention to Susan's false police report with the seriousness it deserved. Officer Rodriguez looked at Susan with the kind of disappointed expression that police officers reserve for people who waste their time with lies. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a serious criminal charge, especially when it's used as retaliation against someone exercising their civil rights. Chief Hale here has been conducting completely legitimate law enforcement business." Her voice cracked, but no words made it out. The fall from power had stolen her script. Susan, still in complete shock from discovering who she'd actually been dealing with, could barely form coherent words. I had no idea. I thought he was just some troublemaker trying to cause problems for our community." But the damage was already done, and the consequences started unfolding with shocking speed. By the next sunrise, she'd vanished from her title. Emergency resignation, no ceremony. Susan submitted her resignation as HOA president, citing unforeseen personal circumstances that require me to step back from community leadership immediately. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to completely distance themselves from her discriminatory actions and prevent the entire community from facing potential federal civil rights violations and massive fines. They were smart enough to realize that their only chance of avoiding legal catastrophe was to throw Susan under the bus as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The official law enforcement investigation launched immediately, with federal civil rights investigators reviewing every policy, every application, every decision made under Susan's leadership. The potential charges included federal civil rights violations, systematic housing discrimination, and deliberate deprivation of rights under color of law. The investigation revealed patterns that went back years. This wasn't just about my rental application, it was about a systematic effort to keep minority families out of Pine Lake Estates through bureaucratic harassment and selective enforcement of rules. The HOA bulletin board came down first, literally. A neighbor ripped it out with a crowbar and a grin. The new HOA president, Mr. Johnson, made his first official act the complete reversal of her discriminatory policies. "Our very first priority as the new board is removing every single discriminatory policy and issuing a formal public apology to every family who was treated unfairly," he announced. "This community will follow the law, period. No exceptions, no special rules, no selective enforcement." Families who'd been previously targeted suddenly felt empowered to participate in community activities without fear of retaliation. New transparent policies ensured completely equal treatment, regardless of race, religion, or family composition. A new resident welcome committee was formed to help all new residents integrate successfully. It was remarkable how quickly the entire atmosphere changed once the fear and intimidation were removed. Children of different ethnic backgrounds were finally playing together freely in the common areas without any adult tension hovering over everything. Susan's quiet disappearance from the community was probably the strangest part of the whole situation. No dramatic public confrontation, no angry speeches or final threats. She just faded away. When I encountered her a week later at the local grocery store, she avoided all eye contact and hurried away down a different aisle. There was something genuinely sad about seeing her like that. A person who had let small-scale power and deep-seated prejudice consume her until she'd lost absolutely everything. She wasn't pure evil, just ignorant and fearful and absolutely drunk on the authority she'd been given. But her choices had consequences, and those consequences were exactly what they should have been. I decided to rent the original lakefront cabin at fair market rate, and the property owner was enormously relieved. "Thank you so much for standing up to her systematic bullying," he told me when we signed the lease. We all knew exactly what was happening, but frankly we were too afraid of retaliation to say anything publicly. That conversation made the entire ordeal feel worthwhile. Sometimes it takes one person willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right and it stops now," to break a cycle of discrimination that's been hurting people for years. The powerful symbolic changes were immediate and visible. The HOA installed a brand new community sign that read, "Pine Lake Estates, a community that truly welcomes everyone." At the first community barbecue, Mrs. Miller raised a toast with tears in her eyes. Behind her, kids of every shade chased fireflies without anyone staring. "Thank you for giving our voices back to us," Mrs. Miller told me at that barbecue. "We were simply too scared to fight her systematic discrimination alone." A black resident said, "My children can finally feel like they actually belong in their own neighborhood." A young mother added, "I was literally about to move my family because of the constant hostile environment. Now I want to stay and help rebuild this community properly." 6 months later, I'm sitting peacefully on my cabin deck, overlooking the beautiful lake, watching families of all backgrounds enjoy the community equally. The sound of all children laughing together fills the peaceful evening air over the water. The community has absolutely thrived under new inclusive leadership, and property values actually increased significantly when the discrimination finally stopped. Susan moved away quietly with no forwarding address, and the law enforcement investigation concluded with a substantial settlement that funded comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs throughout the entire county. Sometimes the very best victories are the quiet ones, where absolutely everyone wins except the prejudice and discrimination itself. Housing discrimination still exists in communities everywhere across America, but it absolutely doesn't have to win. Sometimes all it really takes is one person willing to stand up firmly and say, "This isn't right and it stops now." I honestly thought retirement meant stepping completely back from fighting injustice and discrimination. But sometimes the fight literally finds you, and when it does, you face a crucial choice. Walk away and let the injustice continue, or use whatever authority, knowledge, and experience you have to make things genuinely right. Turns out the most powerful badge I carried wasn't in my wallet. It was the one this community gave me without asking, without saying a word. And honestly, that hits harder than any courtroom win ever could. Maybe the real takeaway here isn't about takedowns or titles. Maybe it's this: when you show up steady and honest, sometimes the whole damn street finds its voice too. If you've stuck with me this far, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Anything like this ever happen near you? You're watching QA Stories. If this one hit home and you feel like tossing some support, that little thanks button's right down there. Stay weird, stay loud, and never underestimate quiet authority.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.